Shabbat Shalom. As some of you know, but many of you probably do not, I am a third-generation Californian, San Diegan born and raised. And I have to tell you that when I moved east, it turns out you people are absolutely terrified of earthquakes. Made no sense to me. I lived in California for most of my young life, and then I moved to Japan for 3 years. Also an earthquake center, a lot more than California, I will add. Went through quite a few big ones. And you know what? I came out here and hurricanes seem a whole lot more of a problem. Because you've got to worry about those things for months. You have to worry about the track, the cone of uncertainty. You don't get a cone of uncertainty for an earthquake. It wakes you up and you are certain you are in an earthquake. And then it's done. And then it's done. You don't have to worry about the next one-ish with a few aftershocks. What's with you folk? Why don't you like earthquakes? Maybe you're just not used to them. It's too much destruction. Please. Some of the largest earthquakes that happened in California when I was there, the Northridge and the Big Bay Area earthquake up in '89. Not the original Bay earthquake, thank you, for those history buffs. There were 60 dead, 70 dead. It's a tragedy. It's terrible. It's horrible. It happens once every decade or two compared to the number who die every year in a hurricane or even blizzards. Come on, it's a pittance. And yet, we recently had an earthquake in Turkey on the border of Syria, and how many passed away there so far that they have been able to count? 40,000. More than 40,000 that are dead, hundreds of thousands injured, more even still that are now homeless, unable to return to their buildings because they are unsound. Now, does that mean that Turkish people are just more fragile than Californians? By no means. I know many people consider Californians to be very fragile. We're not, by the way, but neither are the people of Turkey. So what is the difference? How can it be that a massive earthquake in California leaves us with under 100 dead, and a similar-sized earthquake found in Turkey on the border of Syria leaves 40,000 dead? What is the distinguishing factor? What's the difference?
It's the infrastructure and the kind of building materials they use.
Survey says corruption. You're all saying infrastructure, which is right. You're cutting to the chase, but why is the infrastructure a problem? Is it because they don't know how to mix concrete? Do they not know what rebar is? Have they not been able to study, thanks to our wonderful connected world, all of the technology that's available to make buildings more secure in earthquake-prone areas? When we were on a trip to Japan just a few years ago with my family, there was a fairly large earthquake, one of the bigger ones I've been in, and one person died from the actual damage because they were passing a wall along the street, a retaining wall, and it fell on them because that one wall had not been built to code. Everything else survived, and everyone else survived. Turkey has codes too. They know how to make earthquake-proof buildings, or at least resistant buildings, just like we do in California, Japan, or any other earthquake hotspots. The difference is the regulations that are on the books are not always the regulations put into practice. The regulations put into practice are, well, I suppose we could skimp a little bit on this rebar. We don't need quite as much in the concrete. We can just, make a donation to the inspector. And what's the worst that could happen? Well, we are seeing the worst. Those regulations are not there because government inspectors need jobs. Those regulations are not there in order to inflate the cost of building behind a wall of bureaucratic red tape and unnecessary expenditure. Those regulations are there because they save lives. And it's with that in mind that we turn to this week's Torah portion of Mishpatim, the part of the Torah where if somebody began reading it straight through and from Bereshit, from Genesis, they often give up. Because having gone through the grandeur of the Exodus, and then having seen the wonder of Mount Sinai, they've made it that far, by the time they hit the wall of mitzvot, of commandments and mishpatim, they go, all right, where's the plot? What happened? This is the plot. Rashi, the great commentator of the Middle Ages, famously said the Torah should have began with the mitzvot that are found in Exodus and gone forward from there. Why did we need Bereshit and all of the stories of Genesis? They don't tell us how to live. Yes, they give us examples, moral instruction, wonderful answers to what is our heritage and where did we come from. But they don't actually tell us how to live. Those are not regulations. Mishpatim, these are regulations. If you dig a pit and your neighbor's animal falls into it, who's responsible? If you have a cow and that cow goes and attacks your neighbor, who is responsible? If that cow has attacked before, who is responsible? Yes, I know I'm seeing some hands and that's great, but we're not going to get into all of the halakha right now because I am cognizant that we have a great Kiddush luncheon over there. But these are the reason why God gave us the Torah. God didn't just give us the Torah so that we could have wonderful stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. It wasn't just so that we could have a marvelous Seder with our families. Those are all wonderful bonus actions. But the real action, the reason for the giving of the Torah, was for things like Mishpatim, for the regulations of life. And those are not just what happens here in this sanctuary, built and kept up to code, by the way. Those are the parts of our lives that we live everywhere else within the world. It is not empty ritual. It is not pro forma obeisance to some divine image. It is about taking the instructions that God has given us, which, as Tilly mentioned, remind us that no property is more important than a human life, and translating that into actual regulations that will govern a society to make sure that we behave that way, even when we might make more money if we ignored it, or we might get it done faster if we ignored it. The Torah wasn't given just so that we could bring it out and read at wonderful ceremonies like this. It was written so that we would have a legislation that protected us from us, and that ensured that no matter what we would face as individuals, as families, as communities, as a world, we would have guidance of what to actually do and be right. Not always be rich, not always be joyful in the sense that you are carefree and not being troubled to do more than you are perhaps naturally inclined to do, but to be right, tzaddik, to be righteous. The Torah tells us that disasters like what happened in Turkey from the ignoring of good and reasonable regulations will be repeated again and again. And not only in the far-flung worlds of Turkey, but in Florida, perhaps in Ohio, with a small derailment that may have also been taking place from exactly the same types of reasons. Man-made disasters that are done in the opposition to the rules that God has tried to give us have plagued us since the beginning, which is why God gave us the rules in the first place. Look upon the regulations of the Torah and the chosen regulations of the community as a meaningful contribution to a good life, not as pointless barriers. I'll be happy to open the Talmud with anyone that would like, or Shulchan Aruch if you want to cut to the chase, and discuss the chapter after chapter regulations of how we maintain clean water in a community, how we maintain separation of noxious production facilities such as tanning, the making of leather in the ancient world, which, trust me, you do not want to be living next to, how we control noise pollution within a neighborhood, how we ensure the safety of a community, how we ensure that we have a good and proper society. Our people have been consumed by these questions since the beginning of our people, because God made sure to plant them at the beginning of our journey. That as we stood at Mount Sinai, it was not just about the lofty spiritualism of standing in God's presence. It was taking the inspiration of God's presence and the understanding that God wanted us to live as decent, good people, and translating that into not only good intentions, but deeds, rules, principles that we would adhere to and we would hold each other accountable for. This is the gift of Torah. Don't stop reading just because it got interesting. Don't stop reading just because it began making demands of you. That's the good stuff. Shabbat Shalom.